Welcome to The Quantum State, a podcast exploring the latest research and innovation in quantum computing. Join us as we dive into groundbreaking breakthroughs, trends, and news shaping the quantum landscape. Hello, and welcome back to The Quantum State. So today, let's close out 2023 and talk about predictions in quantum technologies for 2024. So to me, things felt pretty quiet in quantum this year. AI, ChatGPT really took over the hype. But at the end of the year, we definitely got a few surprises in quantum technologies. So today, we're going to go over some of the new stories in quantum tech in 2023 and look forward to those predictions in 2024. And I'm Anastasia Marchenkova, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Peter Rhode and Gavin Brennan.
Hi. Hello.
So let's start on the qubit counts. We talk about this a lot. Recently, Atom Computing announced their 1,000-qubit system, and IBM did as well. Atom Computing is actually a neutral atom system, and IBM is superconducting. So first, let's talk about what does 1,000 qubits really mean here? And what I really mean by this is, with 1,000 perfect qubits, we likely see a lot of real applications today, but we haven't seen that yet. So what are we waiting for, and what are the gaps in those systems?
Well, the gap is exactly what you just said. You mentioned 1,000 perfect qubits, and perfect qubits is a very different reality to what we live in, which is noisy qubits. When people talk about perfect qubits, they often call that logical qubits, the ones that you use for computation, but the ones that you build are not the ones that you actually use for computation. You have to take a multitude of those together to error protect them and use codes to prevent noise. And that overhead means that the actual usable qubits you have is a small fraction of your actual number of physical qubits. When we have 1,000 physical qubits today, probably not one single usable qubit in a scalable error-corrected sense. So it's a different benchmark altogether.
Yeah, but it is more than just being like a kind of a number that sounds big, that looks good on press releases. It is a significant milestone, I think, just because it shows that the companies have been serious about scaling up. There's a lot of things you can do without focusing on improving your architecture with dozens or maybe a couple hundred qubits. But if you really get to where you actually have 1,000 qubits, and particularly an important thing to question is whether they're connected. And I will believe these companies that say they are connected. So if you can do that, it means that you've probably invested a lot of time and money into getting the architecture to a point where it can actually accommodate all those qubits. And so that actually required redesigning and rethinking things beyond what was done, decades previously in experiments. And for example, for superconducting qubits, it's often thought that you're going to have to make the computer in modules, where each module will have, maybe a couple thousand qubits, and that will be cooled by one of these cryogenic coolers to keep the noise down. And then you'll have to connect the modules together. So this sounds to me like, getting at the point where you're actually starting to fill out what would be a module. And for the neutral atom qubits, they can probably fit some more, but they're also going to have some limits.
Yeah, that's one of the big things I think in the superconducting side that we are seeing is this 1,000 qubit perhaps limit to how many could fit into one QuEra set. There's a lot of hardware, wiring, just weight on the plates that goes into the superconducting systems. So it's exciting to see that. At some point back in the day, we thought we could maybe fit 10,000 qubits, but then some of the other hardware issues started popping up on scaling. But yeah, in the modular sense, that's also something that I've seen. So IonQ is a trapped ion company, so it's not neutral atoms, but even a few years ago, they were already talking about the modular aspect here, where they would say they would need to connect a lot of these systems together to get those logical qubits.
Yeah.
I think maybe that should be more the selling point behind these companies making these developments, rather than talking about the raw number, which can be a very misleading figure and a very meaningless one if it's not properly contextualized. Really, the architectural aspects of it is what should be the selling point, because that's really what's indicative of what the forward potential of a platform is.
Yeah, and there's still a little interesting gap there. So IBM has their own measurement of how good a quantum computer is. It's called quantum volume on their end. And they talk a lot about the connectedness, gate fidelity, these sort of things. But different systems are going to have different benefits. And so while Atom, I believe they don't have their own kind of system for saying whether how good their qubits are. Algorithmic qubits is another metric that was proposed by IonQ. And, connectedness in a trapped ion system is technically better. It's all-to-all connectivity because you can just shuttle the ions together. I haven't looked specifically here on the atom side to see what they claim on the connectedness, but it's really interesting right now that we don't have a standard for saying what a good quantum computer is.
Well, the thing is that there is no single standard, and I think maybe that's the problem. Everybody these days likes to reduce things to a single metric or a KPI, but there's no single number that can meaningfully characterize all of the important aspects of a large-scale quantum architecture. And the opinion that I've expressed in the past also is really the ultimate measure is what's the practical utility of it, and at the moment, none of them can say anything meaningful on that size, side of things. So people resort to these other measures as an interim kind of approach to arguing what the forward potential is. But ultimately, no single number is going to give a meaningful picture of what the potential is.
Yeah, why do you think companies do that? Is it more for the investors? Is it more for talent?
Well,
because the scientists know this, right? All the founders, they're not dumb people. They know exactly what this means.
That's exactly correct. But at the same time, people do like to have benchmarks, because whether it's investors or media or whatever the case may be, you need to be able to say something numerical or quantitative about your achievements. So people use these different measures, and inevitably, everybody who comes up with a competing architecture, they'll think, okay, what measure can we define that makes our architecture look better than everybody else's? And so every possible vendor out there will invent their own unique metric and say, we've achieved metric X, we've achieved metric Y. None of them are intercompatible or say consistent things, but they're all just defined to optimally sell their own platform. That's maybe another reason why I'm disinclined from believing any kind of numerical KPI at the moment, because there simply is no consistent way of doing it.
Yeah, actually, I'll make a prediction that we're going to see next year companies start to advertise the number of logical qubits, but that will also be a useless number, because there'll be logical qubits that'll be in very small codes that won't be big enough to actually provide enough error correction for any reasonable or important problem.
That's right. So there'll be big marketing strategies where everybody jumps on board and says, right, you all need to turn your attention to the distinction between physical qubits and logical qubits. And everybody will promote that. And then everybody will start talking about their logical qubits, oblivious to the fact, or at least not being forthright about the fact, that there's no single benchmark for logical qubits either, because a logical qubit also has many different numerical characteristics that relate to how scalable it is. And it'll be the same thing all over again.
Yeah.
Right. So that was another thing I was going to ask. Well, how do we define the logical qubit? Because people look at error correcting codes. In the beginning, they see Shor's code, okay, nine qubits for the error correction side, right? So then they're like, okay, we 10x. And then I say, no, that's just correcting the one, but then there's the gates and you have to keep expanding, right? And so it very quickly blows up. So what do you all think they'll mean when they say logical qubit, and what would you say the definition should be for a logical qubit?
So, I mean, I would say a logical qubit is something that makes use of redundancy, just very much like the classical encoded bit. You're using many physical qubits to encode a single logical qubit. It should be something where there's a a well-defined code space. And in order for you to be able to detect and correct errors should take you outside the code space, and you should be able to, measure when that happens or do an operation which can bring you back to the code space. This can be done in a variety of different systems. We usually think of things in terms of qubits. Each one is a 2-level quantum system, and you have lots of them. But there are other ways to have, kind of encoded qubits. One is the so-called GKP code, named after Gottesman, Kataev, and Preskel from their 2000 paper, where they showed how you can put a qubit inside a harmonic oscillator, a quantum harmonic oscillator. And in principle, a quantum harmonic oscillator has an infinite number of states, but you can put a single qubit code in there, and you can do some correction on that.
I mean, that's the completely correct way to think about what a logical qubit it is, but it still doesn't provide a consistent way of comparing different ones. If someone comes with one platform and says they've implemented the shortcode that you just mentioned using 9 qubits per logical qubit, well, that's a statement that they have a logical qubit. Someone else coming along and making a GKP code, that's a completely different statement that has the same linguistic outcome, that you've got a logical qubit, but completely different interpretations and completely different and inconsistent implications for how the architectures scale. I'm just generally reluctant to reduce anything to a single number or even just a small number of numbers, because it all comes down to how things interconnect holistically. It's not about the number associated with a particular physical or logical qubit. It's about how the whole architecture works together to achieve an algorithmic outcome, and what algorithmic outcome of practical utility that you're able to achieve is the only meaningful benchmark, in my view.
So speaking of that, speaking of linguistics, we're getting deep into that. So recently someone gave me a prediction that think they will see fault-tolerant Shors next year. And I said, what is fault-tolerant? What does that mean?
Oh, that's okay. I'll take that bet.
Yeah,
unless they mean like Shor is in factoring the number 15.
They might, right? So that's another thing people say, like, well, Shors exist, but it's only factored 15 so far, so we're still far away. But yeah, the fault-tolerant part.
Yeah,
what
so
have you all seen?
Okay, so I mean, if they're being precise about that, they're going back to the original idea from von Neumann, who was looking at how to do fault-tolerant classical computing, and this means that you have a procedure which encodes your qubits in these logical code words for logical qubits, and you are able to correct errors and also be able to accommodate errors during the correction as well as during the processing. And if you can get that correction down to a level where the error rate on your logical qubits is less than the physical error rate, then it means you've improved things by putting in a code. And then if you make things big enough and get the error rates small enough relative to that threshold number, then you're in the game. Yeah. So if we saw all those things happen, then yeah, that would be great. But we haven't seen that.
But taking all of that further, back to what I was saying about getting an algorithmic outcome, the computer scientist sort of interpretation of this would be, first of all, quantum computers give, generally speaking, probabilistic outcomes. And what you want is that the majority of the time, the outcome to your quantum computation should be correct. And if the majority of the time it's correct, it means that if you repeat it a small number of times, whatever the majority outcome is, that gives you your vote, and it converges to the correct amount if it's majority correct. So it's not just about do you make the error rates better than they were? That's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. At the end of it all, what you want is that the majority of the time, the algorithm as a whole probabilistically gives you the correct outcome most of the time. And then you can efficiently get correct outcomes. And that's really what the ultimate benchmark is. What's the likelihood of the whole thing giving you the correct outcome, and does that happen most of the time?
I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that, because I really like that definition for like the benchmark. But for example, and I know this is not how it works, but what if you could run it 10 times? It only gives you the right answer 10% of the time, and one of the time it gives you the right one. So it is a minority of the time it gets the right answer, but it does get the right answer in the end. And if you can quickly test that for correctness, like I'm thinking for Shor's algorithm, right? Like you could just multiply it back together and be like, it's correct. Practical purposes, that could be good enough.
Sure. No, what you just said is completely correct. And in the context of the algorithm you mentioned, it's a particular class of algorithms called NP problems, meaning that you can efficiently verify the solution. So sure, if you got a million outcomes to Shor's algorithm, even if just one of them is correct, if you can efficiently classically verify that outcome, which you can for Shor's algorithm by multiplying the numbers together, then you're in business. But not all algorithms have that property. Lots of algorithms don't have the property that you can efficiently classically verify them. And if you don't have that ability, then it boils down to having confidence in the majority outcome.
Awesome. So keep going.
Oh, yeah. It's something like you even see this in just classical computing. Like there are probabilistic classical computers. You can run them on laptops. It's like Monte Carlo sampling. And yeah, you're not always going to get the right answer, but exactly, as long as it's above 50%, then like Peter was saying, you can do majority voting, and the probability you will get the wrong answer after majority voting goes down exponentially fast with the number of repeats. So as long as you're above 50%, then usually computer scientists use 2/3 just to show that you're actually above 50. Then yeah, you're in the game.
Okay, great. So now that we've talked a little about that, I want to read out the QuEra press release, because this was announced during Q2B this year, just a couple weeks ago, and it was interesting. So QuEra announced 48 logical qubits during Q2B this month, which was kind of a big thing because I don't think we've actually had a company announce logical qubits before. But they said researchers successfully executed large-scale algorithms on an error-corrected quantum computer with 48 logical qubits and hundreds of entangling logical operations. What do you all think that means?
48 logical qubits. Well, okay, so we've already entered the era of what I was alluding to earlier, which is everybody jumping on the logical qubit bandwagon without defining any of the details of what that means. Maybe they did, but in the context of this conversation, we haven't. So I have no idea how to interpret what it means when they say 48 logical qubits. Doing what? Are they arbitrarily interconnected? Is it logical qubits when they're acting in isolation? Keeping in mind that the types of errors that things are subject to can be very diverse. It can be the case that usually a single qubit operation will have a very different noise profile than entangling operations, which are generally harder to implement in most architectures. So logical qubit, single qubit gates, no problem. Does that mean it extends to entangling gates? Well, they say entangling operations, but how much entanglement? You need entanglement over many, many qubits in your system. And all of these things are asymmetric. They're not uniform. They're all individually quantified. I wouldn't know how to interpret 48 logical qubits without further qualification.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think it is a milestone in the sense that they've taken seriously the challenge of actually doing logical operations. So that, I mean, for many years now, people have different experimental groups and companies have shown how to make a logical qubit, but the processing has been minimal, and really doing multiple entangling gates on different logical qubits just hasn't been done. I think you got to give credit to QuEra in actually like taking this seriously and doing the demonstrations, including some mid-circuit measurements. That's something that you don't always hear about so much, but for most error correction, which is needed to make any quantum computation work, you use some measurements in the middle of the circuit to diagnose errors and then allows you to correct them. But a lot of companies just haven't shown that. They just do some operations and then measure at the very end. And the reason they don't is because the measurements are harmful oftentimes to their systems. They introduce a lot of noise. They're not very high quality. And so QuEra did do some of that, but it's also pretty clear that they would have to demonstrate a lot more in order to see these kinds of massive entanglement at the logical level that Peter was talking about.
Just to expand on that about the mid-circuit measurements, that's an important distinction. For error correction, you need to do mid-circuit measurements. Classically, post-processors outcomes feed forward to change the rest of the circuit to correct those errors and then move on to the next stage of the computation. Lots of people have demonstrated error correcting codes at a small scale in various different platforms. It doesn't necessarily mean that they do it the correct way using mid-circuit measurements. You could do a proof of principle demonstration of error correction just by running a circuit in bulk, doing all the measurements at the end, and then just arguing based on that post-selected result. You can make an argument about the error correction, but that doesn't mean it would fit into a framework where you're trying to scale it up in a way that you have these successive layers of error correction. People often use all sorts of cheats and shortcuts in experiments. Certainly in my field of optics, this has long been the case. There are things that are technologically difficult, so we just try to work around them and post-select things. So you always need to be very, very careful about the nuanced details of any statements to this effect. What are those nuances? How does that affect ultimately the scalability of the whole system?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit now about error correction. So let's talk a little bit about what's the current state of the art for error correction, because I mentioned the Shor code before, which is different than Shor's algorithm for folks listening in. It's actually error correction, but it has been around for a very long time. And that was kind of the beginning that people get into when they look into error correction, but now there's much more efficient error correction codes.
Yeah, there certainly are, but there's no single answer to what is the state of the art in error correction, because the correct choice of error correction framework is highly dependent upon what the underlying physical architecture is. If you're building a photonic quantum computer, you would be gravitated towards choosing completely different types of error correction procedures than you would in some other kind of architecture, because there are very unique properties of the underlying qubits. With photonic qubits, you measure things, they get destroyed. They also have the property that they're moving at the speed of light, which means that you have all sorts of issues with having to very quickly process things before you move on to the next stage. That's a set of constraints that's different to other physical architectures and would make you choose different types of error correction techniques. People very commonly talk about surface codes and other kinds of geometrical codes related to that as being state of the art. And they're great codes, doesn't mean they're suitable for everything. They're not so useful in optics, for example, but they might be in other types of platforms. So there, again, there's also no single answer.
So, okay, but I will say, we were talking about assigning numbers to error correction and performance. And so at least with quantum error correction, people often use two numbers, not just one, but two, one is called the code rate, which is the ratio of the logical qubits to the physical qubits. So having a constant code rate is seen as good. Maybe, it's like, I don't know, maybe one over 50. So one logical qubit per 50 physical qubits, but that's considered good, as opposed to a rate which would be 0, which is what you get with the surface code because you only get one logical qubit, but the number of physical qubits gets arbitrarily large. The other number is code distance, which is the minimal weight operation which performs a logical operation on your code. And good codes, well, the holy grail would be have a distance which is linear in the number of physical qubits. Because this means if the distance is big, it means it takes a lot of errors to corrupt your data. And remarkably, there has been progress over the past decade in theory and now in experiment also on demonstrating some codes that reach those properties. So we are kind of in a renaissance in that respect on quantum error correction in finding ways to do that. It wasn't obvious. People have known how to do this for a long time in classical codes, but you get obstacles with quantum codes. But people have done that with these low density parity check codes. And my feeling is that at some point the companies will settle down on a code that's good enough, maybe not optimal, but has good enough properties, and then they will work with that and try to optimize control and fabrication in their architectures to make it work on a large scale. And I think once we start to see companies actually settle on a quantum error correction code, means that they've made that decision. And then I think we're going to see rapid advances from that point.
Great. So Gavin, also, this is one of your favorite papers of the year from Alice and Bob, as we keep talking about error correction and Shors and new architectures. It's the paper Computing 256-bit elliptic curve logarithm in 9 hours with 126,133 cat qubits. So first, why are you excited about this? And what are cat qubits?
Yeah, this is an awesome paper to read. Of course, it's a theory paper, and I'm a theorist, so yeah. But yeah, so first of all, it's exciting because it's a huge reduction on previous estimates. Like, I looked at estimates before on how many qubits you'd need to crack elliptic curve cryptography, and the answer was, we're getting estimates in the, 10 million range. That had been reduced to like a couple million, maybe 2.5 years ago. And then there was this big reduction to just 126,000. And when you look at that, it doesn't actually seem so far away. Now, it probably is still, but then you're starting to think, oh, this isn't something which is maybe going to happen in 2040. This could be something that happens in the early 2030s. And the fact that they went through the full analysis, I think is quite encouraging. Now, they make some assumptions about the error rates, so they do an assumption of what's called a biased noise model, where errors are more likely to happen of one type than another type. But that's what a lot of experimentalists and companies do anyway. They also make some assumption about connectivity, but okay, it might grow when you have to limited range of interactions of your qubits, but still, that's really quite a notable number. And what are these cat qubits? Well, they're called cat qubits because they are manifestations of the idea of Schrodinger's cat. So, Schrodinger's cat is the idea by Schrodinger that you could have a superposition of a dead and alive cat. And he wrote this idea, sort of a macabre Gedanken experiment, as a way to question how far can we take quantum mechanics. If you take it to large size systems beyond just single atoms, then you can get these very big objects to be in a superposition state. And the ultimate one is being alive and dead. So cat qubits, we should really call them Schrodinger kitten embryo qubits. They're bigger in a sense than having a single atom in a superposition. It involves a harmonic oscillator mode, which has an infinite number of degrees of freedom. but it's something that can be controlled easily in a laboratory. And the cat qubit just has a 0, which is one type of superposition, and a 1, which is another type of superposition, and with a different sign. And then they showed how these cat qubits work really well in biased noise environments. And yeah, they managed to get this result. So I think it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I spoke to the founder at Q2B, and he said, to come work at the company, you have to love cats. And I told him I'm a dog person. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, very, very exciting. And I think that really underlines the point of the whole kind of hardware that we've been talking about. This is still a lot of new discoveries to be made. And this one kind of came out of nowhere, huge order of magnitudes reduction. And it's starting to get to that really interesting point we've talked about in other episodes, how hardware is increasing, the number of qubits is decreasing, and it's a really interesting crossing point when we get there. So on the next section, I want to talk a little bit about cryptocurrencies and the security side. So Ethereum released its quantum resistant roadmap this year. So I'm personally not surprised that Ethereum was first, since Vitalik Buterin has long been writing about post-quantum encryption and the quantum threat. But it has felt like in the last couple of years, everyone was kind of waiting for someone to make a move. So I'm going to read a little bit from that resistance roadmap. They say the challenge facing Ethereum developers is that the current proof-of-stake protocol relies upon a very efficient signature scheme known as BLS to aggregate votes on valid blocks. The signature scheme is broken by quantum computers, but the quantum-resistant alternatives are not as efficient. Also, the KZG commitment schemes used in several places across Ethereum to generate cryptographic secrets are known to be quantum vulnerable. Currently, this is circumvented using trusted setups where many users generate randomness that cannot be reverse engineered by a quantum computer. However, the ideal solution would be simply to incorporate quantum-safe cryptography instead. There are two leading approaches that could become efficient replacements for the BLS scheme: Stark-based and lattice-based signing. These are still being researched and prototyped. So what do you all think about this approach, and is it doing enough?
Yeah, this one is extremely nuanced. There are lots of considerations when it comes to migrating to post-quantum cryptography. At the most superficial level, the black box definition of these cryptographic protocols is the same. You have a key, or a key pair, you have a message or something that you're signing. What they achieve is the same, but the inner workings are very relevant depending upon the application. In the context of a blockchain application, the efficiency of the implementation of these algorithms is hugely important. If you're just signing an email, it doesn't matter if you've got a tiny little bit of latency. You as the user isn't going to notice it when it's decrypting behind the scenes. But if you've got some blockchain protocol where behind the scenes there are a huge number of signatures going around and having to be verified and signed, any tiny little efficiency difference can manifest itself quite significantly in the overall throughput of a blockchain, the rate at which it can validate transactions. So this is where it becomes a very difficult problem. So other places have made similar announcements, like the Signal messaging protocol that many people use for secure end-to-end encryption. They've also made an announcement that they're switching to post-quantum cryptography. But there the consideration is different. It's more like what I was saying before. The end user isn't going to notice it much if there's a bit of algorithmic efficiency difference. For an Ethereum type of blockchain, it's very hard to know exactly how these differences will manifest themselves, but in a potentially hugely significant way. The other issue to consider is that when we switch to post-quantum cryptography, it's not a matter of just boom, switch the old cryptography off and start using the new one. First of all, you have to remain compatible with what you've had in the past and then transition to new cryptography in the future. Secondly, it's not good practice just to do a hard switch. The new generation of post-quantum cryptography is effectively untested for large-scale deployment. It's being standardized and people have a lot of confidence in it, but the ultimate test is the test of time, where you wait for hackers to hit it with a hammer for many, many years, and if nobody takes all your money, you have confidence that things are correct. In the interim period, people instead double encrypt things using the old generation techniques and the new generation ones, so that our signing is at least as secure as either of them. That means that there's even more overhead. And so all of these trade-offs need to be considered. And it's a really complex task to get right. The current standardization process for post-quantum cryptography being undertaken by NIST, it's not just about defining the algorithm, it's about considering all of the different resource trade-offs. What kind of key links do you need for a given amount of security? How does that affect the implementation of the algorithm, its runtime and resource usage? Getting those trade-offs into the best possible regime is a big part of that standardization process. And one of the hardest things to get right, which can be highly application dependent as well. So I don't have a black and white answer to the question, but those are some of the considerations that make it a very hard thing to get right.
Yeah, and I think actually it's very interesting the fact that we're living in a time where cryptocurrencies are basically accessible around the world, and Bitcoin's been around since 2010, and it's essentially been stable. I mean, yeah, it's fluctuated wildly in value, but it hasn't really been hacked. There have been exchanges that have been hacked, but the protocol itself has been robust, which means that people are starting to feel like it's, as a protocol, not just Bitcoin, but the many other cryptocurrencies as well, like Ethereum, people see them as like, good test beds for new cryptography. So I think it's very good that actually cryptocurrencies will be some of the first adopters, because we know, because there's money to be made, that hackers will do everything they can to crack these post-quantum cryptographic protocols. They'll try like side channel attacks. They'll try to find every vulnerability possible because they can make money. But the thing is, you will know when you've been attacked because you will have fewer coins in your wallet. So I think it's in a sense better that some of the first platforms to trial these post-quantum cryptographic standards are cryptocurrencies, because it's probably better to risk some crypto tokens than, say, your medical records or nuclear secrets. This could be a test bed where we will see live results.
Yeah.
And probably people will announce if they've been hacked. Some won't, of course, because they don't, want to jeopardize their other holdings. But some people will, and then we'll start to see that feedback into the protocols themselves, how they're implemented, and then I think this will be a good, test bed for having them deployed in other areas.
It's a really good point, because blockchains, by their nature, are public. All the information showing the whole history of the ledger and all the transaction records and all the signatures, it's necessarily public. And it's got trillions of dollars potentially attached to it. So coming back to the hammer attack test of time from hackers, that's your test bed. It's hard to fabricate a better test bed.
And especially in the Web3 space, the notoriety, there's a lot of hackers that steal stuff and then just give it all back just to say that they can. So it really is kind of the perfect environment. So Peter, you mentioned a little bit about Signal moving to a hybrid system. Google Chrome a couple months ago also released their hybrid system, where it's, like you mentioned before, the strongest of the two the strongest of the two is going to hold up, right? So even if we crack one, there's a stronger one, we're going to be fine. Is there a hybrid approach cryptocurrencies can take?
Well, I mean, you can certainly. I mean, that the technique is applicable. In principle, it's very simple. Instead of just doing a digital signature on something, you do it twice using two different techniques. But the problem there is that then you've got all the resource overhead, including the latency and the execution time of both of them. And in a blockchain, that's very relevant because the goal of blockchains like Ethereum is to aim towards a high throughput network that can support future financial infrastructure where huge numbers of transactions taking place every second, and Web3 frameworks, like you mentioned, that require a high-speed backend. That potentially undermines all of that and holds it back. It's very difficult to know what the right thing to do there is because there is an inherent contradiction between using double encryption or double signatures, using two different algorithms to slow things down, while at the same time aiming towards this goal of a high throughput network. I don't know how to get that balance right, but it's certainly correct to do it in a hybrid method, but exactly what that implies for Ethereum or blockchains, that's really hard to know.
Yeah, and the upgrades are just a total pain.
Sure. Yeah, they're hugely risky things, right? It can easily go so wrong when you do a blockchain migration, like a hard fork or something.
Yeah, and then if you do hybrid, you might have to do it twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with all that in mind, do you think we'll see any transitioning cryptocurrencies in 2024?
Oh, seems inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean, there are already some that are designed from the ground up, like the
Right.
quantum resistant ledger, that from inception they were using hash-based cryptography. So will there be more? Absolutely. I can't predict which ones, but they're all going to have to. And the other thing to keep in mind also is that the specifications of blockchains can vary enormously. They're all based on the principle of a immutable ledger that you can backward check everything. But they also need to maintain forward integrity. You don't want them to be retrospectively compromised, because in principle, you can go back to a previous point in the blockchain and try and fork it off. You can do that. And you need to remain robust against that. So it's not just about switching the blockchain from now forward, all future transactions to post-quantum cryptography. You've got to think, well, if quantum computers come along that are Shor-enabled and can crack past cryptography, what does that imply for the retrospectively for the previous history of the blockchain? Is the way it described provide retrospective avenues for compromise? That's another nuance that can vary enormously between blockchains as well.
Yeah, and because we're talking financial assets here, there are futures markets for cryptocurrencies, and those cryptocurrencies that do not transition will have the value of those futures go down.
Mm-hmm.
So that can happen, next month, even if we don't get quantum computers until that could be viable candidates to crack it until like the 2030s. Futures values can respond now.
I mean, on that front, then it is also very important then that major blockchains clearly state what the quantum resistance roadmap is, like, as you were saying, Ethereum is doing. If a blockchain doesn't have that kind of forward roadmap and make it clear what its commitment to a PQC migration process is, people could look at that and say, well, the forward value of this blockchain is going to be nothing, because in the future this is going to be compromised because they haven't got a migration roadmap to make it post-quantum secure. So if the forward value is zero, then by definition, under a normal discounting economic model, the spot price is also zero. So it affects the value of blockchains today, what their future integrity is, and what confidence you have in their forward security. So making these announcements about transitions is extremely important, and failing to do so completely undermines the present day value of blockchains.
Yeah, before we started taping this episode, we were talking about prediction markets again, and it keeps coming up. So I'm pretty sure we should have an episode soon where we just sit down on live stream setting up all these prediction markets for the questions that we answer. That would be a lot of fun. Speaking on the prediction markets and surprising news stories. So last month, a person on LinkedIn posted that he had cracked 2048-bit RSA. I remember I personally saw this news article on my Google homepage. I was half asleep and I just kind of chuckled and rolled over to go back to sleep. And then, to my surprise, in the next day or two, the media picked it up and they were all over it, and all these articles started popping up. So, summary of that, he kind of refused to give out the details, asked people to DM him for the paper. I also heard rumors it was actually embedded with a virus, but that was someone actually just commenting on my TikTok videos on that. So I don't know if that's true. But obviously nothing has come of it since. So yeah, definitely want to be a little more productive than mocking it a little bit. But here's the question. If you had cracked RSA, what would you actually do? Would you publicly announce it? Would you publish it? Would you kind of just run away and hide underground from the NSA and the CIA so you stay alive? What would you do?
Well, I guess that depends on your personality type. If you're an honest person and an academic at heart, you might announce it and publish a scientific result. Otherwise, you'd obviously just go and use it to steal someone's wallet. You'd say, which crypto wallet has the biggest amount of money? I'll crack that one and take all their cash. It would be surprising that if someone did neither, which appears to be the case here. There's neither an announcement how it was done scientifically, nor any evidence that they just ran off with billions of dollars, which means I'm not actually familiar with this, so I'm only speculating, but there may be some other reason behind it. Were they manipulating markets or attempting to and make money that way? You can also completely easily make money that way too. It's hard to know.
Yeah. So I can tell you that, like, if I was working with the team that actually managed to do this, I would tell the intelligence agencies of my country, the U.S.
You would go there first?
I would, yeah.
Okay.
And that's partially out of self-preservation. You know, like, as a scientist, my first inclination is always to just, let the world know. So I would just, take a big composite number and write down its prime factors and say, look, I did this. But there are security implications to that. Suddenly the calculus changes. Yeah.
I mean, yeah,
I think
you're quite right.
I would do that.
It is somewhat more of a bigger issue than how much cash can I make, right? This has pretty big implications if you can actually go and crack RSA 248.
Yeah.
And you do want to be incredibly intelligent in the way and sensitive about the way you handle that, if it is actually true.
Right. I think that was my big problem when I saw this is first that's not how the announcement would take place, and also the lack of proof, right? So one argument that someone posted to me was like, oh, well, he doesn't want to reveal trade secrets, but I was like, that's fine. Give him a key, give him a public key, and have him give you the private key. The proof can be there without revealing trade secrets. So
you can do a zero knowledge proof that they have the protocol by cracking a number that you give them.
Yeah. So we could go down to that. So it was definitely, I guess I wasn't surprised that the media picked it up, but I was a little disappointed in the end.
I've stopped being disappointed in things I see in the media. I just by default assume the worst unless otherwise there's a reason to.
Yeah.
Great. So now I want to talk a little bit about the corporate engagement in quantum technologies. Again, sometimes there's a little bit of mocking in the field about like, oh, well, this company is doing this sort of research on quantum and it's dumb because we're still so far away. But a lot of companies are starting to engage in the technology. And so I wanted to go through some of these and discuss which things will work well in quantum computers and which might not. So one of the interesting ones and kind of relevant to this time, Moderna, which no one had heard of before, but now everyone knows that name. So they said that they're using the combination of advanced formulation discovery with generative AI to create new mRNA drugs using quantum approaches. Will this work on quantum computers?
So there are a lot of buzzwords in that sentence. The combination of generative AI and quantum is one that's not completely clear to me, but certainly there's room for quantum algorithms in quantum simulation, which is relevant to these sorts of things. When you're talking about looking at biomolecular interactions, that's heavily influenced by quantum phenomena that can't be easily classically simulated. So there's certainly the potential for quantum algorithms to advance things in medicine and drug design, genetics, biotechnology. The moment that people start combining it with other buzzwords by saying generative AI, quantum techniques, biochemistry, I'm thinking that there are too many buzzwords here. That doesn't just happen on its own. That's by design. So when I just see quantum on its own, that's fine. When I see too many other buzzwords, I immediately start asking what's going on.
Yeah. Right. I mean, so, okay, I guess to sort of give the most optimistic point of view, you could say that, one of the most valuable things that quantum computers could give pharmaceutical industry is not necessarily discovering new drugs, but being able to accelerate the process of bringing those drugs to market. So there's an enormous lag time in many countries like the US, for good reason, to bring drugs to market because they have to be tested because they're going to be used on humans. This can take over a decade. And a lot of that lag time is just in testing. And so if you could accelerate that process, for example, by finding flaws quicker, where maybe, some catalysis reaction doesn't happen and you don't get the molecule you thought you were going to get, or it's not, some proposed pharmaceutical is not actually binding in the way it should, then that could be a huge benefit. It'll knock out the ones that won't work quicker. Yes, maybe there is a way to do that. I don't see that anytime soon. The number of qubits and the number of operations necessary to do things at the level of testing pharmaceuticals, or the molecules that are on the scale for these kinds of drugs is in the hundreds of millions, and it's a very long distant process, I think, for us getting to that level. But I don't know. I mean, it's good that I think it's good they're looking into it, but I wouldn't hold my breath for major demonstrations in that area soon.
Yeah, definitely. So, and one of the things is, just because the press release has a bunch of buzzwords doesn't mean there's not good fundamental research going on, right? Because as we've talked about in previous episodes, simulation chemical reactions are a big hot topic, a near-term application potentially. And so there's a lot of companies in that space getting in. So the next one I want to talk about, and JP Morgan has been in the quantum space for a very long time. They're collaborating for the financial applications, but also Moody's Analytics. If you look at the QuEra press announcement, they are involved on the hardware side there, and have also the same week also put out a press release with multiverse computing on the simulation side as well. So that was interesting to me to see the financial industry moving more and more towards also the hardware space. So again, will this work on quantum computers, or will it not?
I mean, it's always comes down to the distinction: can it work and be helpful in principle versus does it in practice? That's hard to answer, but certainly there's potential. People in many different areas within quantum computing have been looking at optimization algorithms that could be applicable to portfolio optimization, or optimizing portfolios under the Black-Scholes option pricing model, that kind of thing, where you get these very complex optimization protocols that are hard to do classically. And people have certainly come up with arguments showing that quantum methods can yield enhancement here. Whether it amounts to making any dollars in practice, that's harder to know. Especially in an asymmetric market where it would initially at least be a very small number of players that would have access to quantum optimization while the most wouldn't. It's hard to know how that would affect the dynamics of the market. Would it just result in those handful of market participants with quantum technology completely dominating the space now? Or would it just be a much more subtle benefit that may not actually be tantamount to a huge increase in portfolio margins? It's really hard to know, but there's definitely potential, at least in theory, at an algorithmic level. I mean, one of the biggest problems in economic modeling isn't so much the algorithms themselves. It's you don't have perfect information about things. It's the inability to have full knowledge of the system, which often limits what you can do. Same in like weather modeling. You've got a chaotic system, and it's not that the computers can't run the equations. It's that it's hugely sensitive to initial conditions, and you can't know them perfectly, no matter how hard you try. These sorts of things are very fundamental, and quantum computing doesn't offer a solution to that in any way.
Right. One of the option pricing experiments can be done just on a 5-qubit superconducting chip with a lot of noise. It's been around for a while.
Yeah.
So
and some things you see too is companies using quantum-inspired algorithms. So, like for example, Multiverse uses tensor network calculations. So these tensor networks were originally designed in their context to study many-body quantum systems, like how electrons hop on a surface. And turns out you can apply some of those same methods to studying other problems in finance. So even though you're not using a quantum device to speed things up, you're using computational tools originally developed to study quantum systems to speed up financial predictions.
So I want to close out by asking about the BTQ and Foxconn collaboration. So it's announced that's entered into a research and collaboration agreement with Hohenheim Research Institute. So can you all elaborate a little on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I should just point out that Foxconn has large offices in Taiwan, and BTQ has their main research office in Taipei. So they're physically close in that context, and yeah, they basically signed an agreement to pursue research together on post-quantum cryptography. And given the fact that you have the TSMC, the largest chip manufacturing plant in the world, also in Taiwan, is sort of a strong collaboration. I think I've heard that the Taiwanese government has made the pursuits of post-quantum cryptography a national priority. So yeah, I think it's a good sign that you're seeing these different companies start to work together for like a common goal.
And elaborating on Taiwan in terms of its fairly unique position, Taiwan is globally a dominating force in semiconductor manufacturing, especially via TSMC that Gavin mentioned. Now, a big aspect of implementing post-quantum cryptography is not just the software algorithms behind it, but lots of the cryptography we rely on today has hardware level optimization, because these are routines that get used so frequently, they just put those algorithms directly into the chipset. And so there's a huge place in the market for people to be designing hardware optimization units that you might, for example, in an ARM type of model. ARM, the company that makes lots of the instruction set architectures that we rely on today, they have a model where they design how these instruction sets and hardware modules work and license them out. Certainly, there's a lot of space for a similar thing when it comes to hardware level optimization of post-quantum cryptographic primitives to replace the current generation of hardware acceleration units that exist in our chips. So being there in the place where the manufacturers of semiconductor hardware are, that are designing all the hardware, combined with expertise in post-quantum cryptography and the ability to find that intersection between hardware and software, that's a really, really important role in the economy.
Yeah, and I think one of the really cool parts of that collaboration is actually the work to support the academic community in promoting the standardization as well. We've talked about before, the really interesting part of this is you need cryptographers, you need physicists, you need a lot of different academics coming together to do all this, a lot of the hacker types to kind of break through the systems. So it's good to support that as well.
Yeah, it's a hugely intersectional area that really, as you said, requires expertise from very specialist expertise from quite a few different areas. It's very hard to find that.
Definitely. So now I want to close out with some rapid fire general predictions. So very, very quick answers. How many qubits will we see next year?
What type of qubit?
You can pick your type of qubit.
Well, if we're just talking arbitrary qubits, where a company says we have this many qubits and that's the end of the statement, then the answer is I don't care how big the number is, because it probably, by implication, isn't actually useful. If they said we've got one error-protected qubit that we can do the identity operation on, in other words, no computation, just holding it in memory, but maintaining its quantum state effectively over a long time scale, that I would find incredibly exciting. If someone just had one logical qubit that they could keep as a quantum memory for a very long period of time, that would excite me.
Yeah, well, I feel like I should have a shot of scotch right now, but to make these predictions properly. But I will predict we're going to see 3 to 10,000 qubits announced that are connected qubits, but maybe not. Maybe there might be some bottlenecks in the connectivity, but it'll be something where, in principle, there's a pathway from any one qubit to another by gates. So I'll put out the number 10,000.
Wow, that's nice. I know IBM has a roadmap to double every year, so we're at least getting the 2,000 from them next year because they haven't wavered from that roadmap. All right, next, will we solve a real world problem?
That's a very interesting question. Maybe the initial question to ask is, what's the first real world useful problem that we could implement that will be of practical use? And even that doesn't have a clear answer, because different algorithms can be inherently suited to different types of architectures. I don't have a prediction on that, when we're going to have the first utility. That I think is perhaps more likely to be a black swan kind of event. But I have a feeling it won't be something like cracking a code. It'll probably be more something in the quantum simulation space, where there's a lot more maneuverability and the type of algorithms you could deploy.
I'm going to say no. I think, there are already annealers like D-Wave has said that they've used their device for, routing traffic. But I don't really consider that. I mean, yes, it's a real world problem, but if you spent all the money for that quantum annealer on just more time on a supercomputer, you could have done the same thing and probably faster. So, I don't think we're going to see a speed up on a real world problem next year.
I also say no. I think it's more 3 years. So next one, is quantum winter coming?
Can we just define quantum winter? This is where everything is broken?
Or, funding, or whatever you think quantum winter is?
I think certainly there'll be a pivot in the market at some point, because we're clearly going through a boom stage where everybody's just flooding the market with investment, thinking, wow, this is the next hot thing, can't go wrong. But whenever that happens, there reaches a point where people realize that they've overestimated the potential of certain technologies, or someone comes in and qualifies a statement, you realize it's not quite as profitable as you think. There'll be a huge correction at some point. So using that definition, an investment quantum winter, there will be one, but I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as creative destruction. It's the market learning from what works and what doesn't. From that learning, reallocating investment into the things that are more likely to work. So quantum winter, yes, but I don't see it as bad.
But next year?
Oh, possibly, but certainly in the next few years, I would think. I mean, how long can the hype last?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen next year. There's going to be all kinds of crazy stuff happening, like for the election in my country. But I don't think we're going to see quantum winter next year. But I can see it happening. Maybe 3 years from now.
Interesting. So for my take, I think quantum winter kind of already passed. I thought that was the last 2 years, just because there was a lot of skepticism in the market. And for me, it feels like, especially seeing what's come out in the last few months, we're kind of on the upswing. We lost a lot of talent over the last 2 years. Martinez left Google. A couple of people left into the AI industry, which I think was a big loss for the field. But 2024 is going to be huge for NIST releasing the standards. So I think the PQC side is going to we're back on the upswing now, with that leading into the next few years of the simulation and the early applications.
Interesting. So for the winter that passed, do you think it was mainly for hardware companies then?
I think so. I think there's a lot of hardware companies that have died off, and there's consolidation going on. Still going to be a little bit of consolidation, but it's my view is that this is the next era of quantum companies in the next few years. They're actually going to be focusing on applications, and they're just starting to come up.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if there'll be a winner for software. That would be interesting.
I think that's where I saw the consolidation, where people were trying to build software for stuff that doesn't exist yet. Right. Also. And, there's, in the venture capital industry, there's an issue where you have to exit within 10-ish years in some way. And just looking at those timelines, I'm like, you're just a software only company may not get there.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
All right. So any other predictions you want to put on the record
for next year?
Yes.
Perhaps back to the PQC issue. I think in the next year, we're going to start seeing mass announcement of PQC migration strategies and adoption of PQC. So the cryptographic level, it's much more predictable, I think. Everybody knows that PQC is necessary, and it's not a bet on any particular quantum computing architecture. It's a bet on quantum computing as a whole. And that's a much safer bet, because it's a bet on the entire market rather than a particular technology. So there, I'm very confident we're going to see a very rapid change in transitioning to post-quantum cryptography.
Yeah. Huh.
I think this is where our prediction market episode will do really well.
Sure, market knows best, right?
Well, does it? Sometimes, I guess. But if it's about money, the market is what's best.
Sure, by definition, it is, right? It's self-defining.
Yeah.
All right. So there's nothing else. Now we have this on the record. So next year we can review it and see what we got right and what we got wrong. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Quantum State. Make sure, if you're on YouTube, to comment down below. If you have any other questions, want us to talk more about certain topics, happy to do that. If you are on Spotify, you can find us there, or any platform where you get your podcasts. And thank you so much.